Hello and welcome to a special election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. The November presidential election is fast approaching, and on Monday, September 26th, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump will face off in the first 2016 presidential debate. This will be a critical moment for both candidates. As we head toward that debate and the final 6 weeks of the campaign, there's a lot to discuss and dissect. My co-hosts with me today are political reporter from WNYC Radio, Brigid Bergin, and political reporter from DNAInfo, Jeff Mays. Thanks both for being here.
Thanks.
So let's jump into looking at that debate that's fast approaching. Brigid, what are you looking for as we head towards it?
Well, it's exciting. This will be the first time we will see Donald Trump have to debate someone one-on-one. And this is definitely not Hillary Clinton's first rodeo. She has done this many times. I often, when I think back of the history of Hillary Clinton debating, there's that moment, I'm sure you'll remember it, when she was running for Senate in New York and she was campaigning against Rick Lazio. And so they were debating head to head, and there was that moment where he walked out from behind the podium and he challenged her to sign this statement. And it was such, I mean, I remember, I was young, I remember watching it as a kid and thinking it made me so angry, and it came across as this real challenge to her, not just as another candidate, but as a woman. I think that is the type of thing, maybe not in the exact same manner, but that posture is something that I think Donald Trump could adopt and could play very badly for him. So seeing the two of them go head to head and just that posture between the two of them, I think is going to be really interesting. Obviously, also, we know that she has so much more depth and breadth around policy. That's really where her expertise is, to see what Donald Trump has been able to bring to the table at this point. We know he has been preparing. To what extent does he actually lay out real proposals that are more substantive than some of these quick taglines that we know he's gotten really good at and that are very sticky for his campaign?
Right, we know he's been very adept at sort of taking a detailed question and not answering it, but giving a sort of brief, strong statement that a lot of his supporters seem to respond to. Is he's this, sort of tell it like it is, not politically correct candidate.
Right.
What about you, Jeff?
I mean, I think this is going to test the roles that they both have kind of taken in this election. Trump is this sort of P.T. Barnum-like showman who is all about the spectacle and making bombastic statements, whereas Hillary Clinton has been the sort of professor. She, I've been here before, here are the deep policy details, as Brigid said. Here are my very specific plans, my 20, 30-point plans to do X, Y, and Z. And I think those two things are going to go head to head. And, there's risk for both of them in this. So for Trump, the risk is that showmanship will not be enough, and he will be unveiled as not having enough actual policy recommendations, and that could be a deep flaw for him. But for Hillary Clinton, she risked coming off looking boring, staid, the sort of career politician, and I think that's the type of thing that Trump is going to try to play on and try to show her up with his sort of bombastic statements. And I'm really interested to see how she's going to respond when he says something that's really outrageous during the debate. He's going to plan a few zingers just to purposely try to throw her off on the debate. How is she going to respond? I think people are going to be looking for her poise to see how she responds to his bombastic statements.
I do wonder if she is going to continue to be sort of unflappable in those circumstances. When it comes to sort of a debate setting, she's pretty poised, and it's going to be very interesting if she can indeed keep that poise. I think also that Trump is, he's bounced back and forth, we've seen over the last couple months, especially in terms of, is he trying to sort of moderate a bit? Is he trying, he's using the teleprompters more, for example, right? So is he going to come into this debate and be a little more presidential, which is a term he's used many times? I can be the most presidential, you've ever seen, but it's boring, right? He said. Is he going to do that, or is he going to come in sort of guns blazing and try to really take her down?
I mean, I would be surprised if we didn't see those big moments from him. But I think he recognizes now, and this is why you're starting to see the slight shift, as when, when Hillary Clinton fell ill, he kind of just wished her well. He didn't really go on the attack. I think he's realizing there are moments when he's going to have to pull back and try to look more presidential, to try to look like he can actually run this country, meet with world leaders. And I think the debate is going to be an opportunity for that. But as I said, there's still going to be those bombs in there. I just can't see him not coming in with those big zingers that he's going to try to throw her off balance with.
And Donald Trump is such a creature of our current political media climate. I mean, that is how he created himself. Yeah. And the idea that he can just turn that off, I mean, I don't think that he can escape who he actually is. And I think that will come through. And to many extent, that's worked for him throughout this campaign in some respects. But I think it will be stark, if nothing else, to see it in contrast to Hillary Clinton. I was reading, Jill Lepore has this great piece in The New Yorker looking at the history of the debate and the history of presidential debates. And it's fascinating to think that the date, the time that they will be doing this debate at Hofstra, September 26th, is the anniversary of the first Nixon-Kennedy debate. And when you think about what came out of that debate, like what do people remember from that debate? There are not a lot of policies that people talk about. They remember that image of Richard Nixon just standing there, looking, very pale and looking sweaty compared to Kennedy. And so I think it's one of those things you hate to think that something so important could boil down to something so superficial, is the image and the way someone is projecting themselves. And yet, when it is a televised debate, that is part of it. And then we have the added dimension in our current, political climate of the Twitterverse and the ongoing sort of echo chamber that will take place from the moment one of those bombs gets dropped. It will go on and on through Twitter, and the clips will start being turned into GIFs, and we'll see it on Facebook for days afterwards. So not only will we see the impact of the night, but then how it plays out for the days afterwards. And
we see the things that turn into the social media moments become what's in publications and what's in our news reports and what's on the radio. I mean, these things are the things that really do push the news cycle because they are the impactful moments. I think what you just hit on, Brigid, is sort of a test of this election in terms of, and it's been a test of many elections, as you just indicated, but about the visceral responses that people have to candidates versus how much we're paying attention to substance. And Donald Trump is, again, sort of testing those norms and testing, how people respond to political candidates. Are we going to see him pushed on specifics in policy? Are we going to see? I mean, this is a big question for Lester Holt, right? And we saw some drama around Matt Lauer hosting on NBC a forum with the two candidates separately, back to back, and him not pushing Trump on his claims about opposing the Iraq War and other things that he has said. Are we going to see, with all this pressure now on Lester Holt, how do you think he approaches this? I mean, we've all sort of been in this position of having politicians in front of us that we're asking questions to. How do you think he comes into this?
I mean, I think he's going to be ultra prepared. After the beating that Matt Lauer took in the media and the media critics, it was pretty embarrassing for him, I'm sure. And I think he's going to have to kind of walk that fine line where he's going to have to be tough with Trump, but also still be tough with Clinton at the same time. He doesn't want to be seen as pushing one or the other, as Matt Lauer was seen as being kind of more unfair to Hillary Clinton and kind of being easy on Trump. So I think he's going to have to come in and definitely be firm with Donald Trump and demand some actual answers. And that may look kind of combative at times, but I think, Trump coming into this realizes that he's going to have to spell out some sort of policy at some point.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, look, if you have Clinton on one side and you have Lester Holt on the other, who's a respected journalist, both pushing him for more clarified answers, just doing your job as a journalist. Hey, you know what? You did support the Iraq War. That's not truth.
Yeah, I mean, he's pretty good at coming back and just saying his version of what he likes to claim happened and saying it in such a, sort of powerful way. And there's only so much time that moderators have, right? I think one thing I've seen that's been effective in debates is when a moderator will ask a follow. When the candidate doesn't answer the question and a moderator asks a follow-up to say, oh, but my question was, and the candidate still doesn't answer, I've seen the moderator say, okay, so no specifics on that, we'll move on. And that's a really effective tactic, I think, that also, though, isn't that confrontational. It doesn't take it to, it doesn't elasticize the moment, but it sort of points something out that's pretty definitive and clear.
I think we saw through some of the debates earlier during the primary season that there were some moderators that tried to push a little bit harder, but he has a particular skill at laying out the truth that is his truth at the moment. And it will be, I think, a real both test and opportunity for Lester Holt to show that this can be an effective forum for getting out some substance and for pointing out those holes in answers. And a strategy like you described would allow him to do that in a way that allows him to get through enough topics. I mean, the one thing that could happen also is if the goal is to really push him on, specific topics, if they spend too much time, it may end up being a debate that ends up focused on just a handful of issues. And I think that would be a disservice as well, because we want to make sure that we get through as much as possible with these people who are vying for the most important job in the world.
We're talking about Donald Trump here because there's been this very clear deficit in him laying out specifics and him evading questions and him also contradicting himself and changing positions and lying about his positions. But there's also Hillary Clinton, obviously, and we know that she's more of a wonk and more of a policy person. But what do we need to see or hear from her in the debate? Where are things at right now for her in terms of some of the issues that she might be trying to overcome, or where does she need to head here?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen in the day or so since she had her sort of fainting incident, she was doing some interviews yesterday, and so I was looking at Twitter, and some of the responses were, she seems much more relaxed, much more calm than normal. She seems, human, and so I think she's going to have to try to send some of that across in the debate. I mean, it's a danger area for her because if she can't come across as too angry, for example, because she'll be criticized for that. At the same time, she can't let Trump push her around either. So she's going to have to find that sort of spot where she can show her policy knowledge, but also kind of soften this tough image that's been put around her, where people are questioning her, questioning her as a human being. Is she a real person, or is she just a machine politician? She's going to have to find a way to kind of make that come across on the TV screen.
As the first woman who will be on stage as a presidential candidate, I mean, she has been, I think, scrutinized in a way that no other presidential candidate has ever faced, short of probably Barack Obama being the first African-American presidential candidate, obviously for very different reasons. But as a woman running for this office, it's interesting that there are things that I think we look for from her and expect of her that are different than what we ask of Donald Trump in posture and in delivery. No one is looking for Donald Trump to be more human because Donald Trump is Donald Trump, right? And people accept him for that bombastic, aggressive businessman who's, really, really great. And by his own declaration, I think for her, she did have a bad week in September with the health scare, and not just because everyone gets sick. She's that in of itself is not the problem. It is the problem of how her campaign handled it, and it is the pattern that is reinforced. This idea that there's information that they have that they do not believe the public should be privy to, for whatever reason. And obviously she has a history, of being in the public eye for so long that she understands that there's information that can damage you, that can damage your campaign, your position, your policy. And yet, in a situation like this, it made her appear vulnerable in a way, and it appeared secretive in a way that even people who are her supporters, I mean, I saw a tweet from David Axelrod saying, for someone with a penchant for privacy, why, paraphrasing obviously, why did they mishandle this so badly? Why did they take a situation that could have been, very clear? You could have said, she's been diagnosed with pneumonia, she's not feeling well, but she was the senator from New York and she believes that she needs to be there for the 9/11 ceremony. She's going to do her best to be there. And then even if something happened, at least it would be out there that she's not feeling well. Now, of course, at that point, then there would be all other forms of criticism. But it just feeds into this idea that they have a problem with being forthright. And so I think that during the debate will be a point of attack for Trump. And to your point, seeing how she responds to those attacks, I think it will be a real test and very interesting to see how she deals with the attack on why she didn't admit that this diagnosis had come 2 days before she had a public health incident. Obviously, the emails will be a source of attack. So, I think more so than just how she presents herself and how she speaks and whether she appears presidential in a traditional sense, which is going to be male, how she does what she says and how persuasive she is, that she will be someone who will represent people well because of her positions, and that we don't need to worry that they're trying to keep things from the American public will be important.
I just want to be clear that that I think those expectations of Hillary Clinton are not necessarily fair, but they're there nonetheless.
Right.
So I just want to be clear on that. And then secondly, you're totally right. This whole incident with the health scare was self-inflicted. I think it was humid that day. I think most people would have understood if she had not felt well, she left. And then she, went home, saw a doctor. She didn't ditch the press corps. People would have understood that, hey, people get sick sometimes. It happens. She's fine. Pneumonia and people of her age is fairly common. It's not a big deal. Most people recover from it fine. So I think you're right. Like they are hypersensitive to how they are responded to in the press. And I think that affected how they acted. I mean, even, you saw that video of her getting into the van, the people surrounding her trying to block what was obviously her being unable to get into the van herself, as opposed to being honest at this point and saying, hey, here's what's happening. Let's just come out and say it. She's going to be fine, and we'll reveal some more health records later if that makes you feel better. So it was really a self-inflicted based on just past history of how they've dealt with issues.
Some things are more clear than others. I think that the email situation was a huge, mistake, and the way they handled that was clearly problematic. I think that if you have a diagnosis of pneumonia or you're feeling sick, I think it's a real campaign question. Do you send out a statement to the press? Hillary Clinton's doctor diagnosed her with pneumonia today? I'm not sure that's cut and dry, right? Could they have handled things better on the Sunday as she was leaving the event? Certainly. But they need people in the room then to say to her, we have to do things differently than you've done them in the past.
Right. Well, and to that point, I mean, we have the pleasure of sitting here and having this conversation with hindsight, and we can look at it and say, if she had done this when the diagnosis, if she had made the diagnosis public, then when this thing happened, it would have been less of an issue. The only thing that I would say, it's not as though she doesn't, and her campaign and her advisors don't have the experience of knowing what happens when they make a decision to withhold information and then that information comes out, and how that can be potentially difficult. And I think to your point, absolutely at a minimum, how they handled it on the day of was really damaging. And that almost is worse than, set aside anything else. Say they just decided she was not actually feeling that bad. They didn't need to make it public. When you are in such a public setting, you're surrounded by public officials, you're at a memorial for something that the entire nation pays attention to, and you have what is, by all accounts, a relatively minor incident, well then just say that, right? Why spend hours waiting for, the official statement to come out, 5 hours after people actually see the thing happen because someone happens to be standing there at the right time with a cell phone to capture it on video. I think that is problematic. But again, it's an easy thing to talk about when you are days after an event.
I think this is another instance of what we've seen with her campaign, which is this tension of trying to do things a little differently than she's done in the past, or especially versus 08 in the primary, versus their old habits and her old habits and her preference for not being proactively communicative. And I think that that's been a real tension. I think they've had a tug of war there back and forth, even the way she sort of started her campaign and, was trying to be a bit more out there and went on her, van trip. I mean, these things sort of vanished fairly quickly, as they might have to, but we continue to see that tension for her, and whether she embraces all sorts of things that she's been criticized for in the past, like being a woman, like being possibly the first woman to be president. How much do you embrace that? Some of these questions that they've battled with now for a long time, and you see that push and pull. But the bottom line for me is, this is another example where, are you being proactive or are you being reactive? And if you choose to be reactive, you very often get burnt.
Well, I mean, this election, I think more than almost any other in recent history, clearly not about the issues. So when you have these sort of distractions that can blow up on social media in a minute, as you said, I've seen like 20 gifs of her drinking water in the past couple of days, as some sort of indication of her health status. You have to be very careful. You need to think about how this is going to look. Unfortunately, I think, I wish we were spending more time talking about these issues and less time talking about, whether Hillary Clinton had pneumonia for a couple of days.
Well, I think there's no question we're going to see that in the debates. There's going to be real policy questions, and we saw, even as much as it became a story about Matt Lauer, unfortunately, in even the forum that occurred, we saw this question of asking Trump, for example, what's this plan for defeating ISIS? And he said, as he often does, a bunch of sort of words and sentence fragments that didn't actually make any real sense. Either he does have a plan, or it's a secret plan, or the generals might come up with a plan, yet he's going to fire most of the general. So we're going to see, I think, them push on that, which will be good, which will be refreshing for the debate. The question is, does a moment of, Trump intimidation or some sort of Clinton gaffe or whatever it might be, does that overpower things? That's to be seen.
Well, I go back to my Lazio example from the beginning. Sometimes in that setting, those moments that would appear to be so aggressive and, I think, macho and potentially effective in other settings can fail disastrously in this type of setting. And so it will be interesting to see if the types of attacks he's been able to use in past debates are as effective when he has to go one-on-one with her.
I think the one thing that he's clearly going to push, even though he doesn't have a lot of credibility on this, is trust, right? And her questions around the emails and around telling the public what's what. I'm very interested to see how she handles the email question at that debate. She's gotten closer and closer, and her campaign has gotten closer and closer to just sort of full-fledged apology, right? And how does she actually word that, and does she try to sort of cut that out right from its first mention by really in the most direct terms with the most people watching, trying to really put that as close to bed as she can by giving a really strong direct apology? I don't know, that might be too risky for her, but that's something I'm certainly interested in watching here. Let's talk a little bit more about transparency. We have issues around health. We have issues around email. We also have issues around taxes and Donald Trump not releasing his taxes. What's going on there? I mean, what do you think is happening? There's people who say his argument that he's under audit and he can't is bunk. What's happening there, and what do people need to know?
I mean, I think, first of all, to equivocate, her issue with the health scare, with the fact that, for the first time in, 40 years, that he has not released his taxes and has been given reasons that have been clearly been debunked as to, why he can't release his taxes.
That a presidential candidate.
So it's actually pretty frightening. It kind of feels like this election has kind of hit a sort of low point where that really hasn't fazed him. It hasn't really hurt him with his supporters at all. People don't seem to care that he hasn't released his taxes, or people don't seem to care that there's questions around his charitable giving, whether it was actual charitable giving or whether, as the Washington Post reported this week, that he's giving away other people's money and calling it his own. So those are like really big questions that the electorate at times seems to be kind of ignoring, especially his supporters. So, going into these last few months, there doesn't seem to be a lot of people to convince You know, this is really about kind of getting their supporters out to the polls as much as possible because, you know, people have already heard these questions about Donald Trump and his supporters don't seem to care. There doesn't seem to be an issue with them in terms of him not releasing his taxes or his business record or his history.
I mean, I think the fear in releasing the taxes is, you know, obviously the question around charitable giving, but also the idea of him either, you know, likely not being as wealthy as he has claimed or paying so much less in taxes than the very base that he has appealed so strongly to that he could potentially risk alienating some of those people who he needs every single one of to turn out if he has any shot. I think the idea that at this point it is about getting out the vote is true. However, there are those folks who, you know, are not, they are sort of the dispassionate voters who, you know, still do need to make up their minds, and those swing voters who I think are waiting for that one last thing to make up their mind. I think it'll be interesting to see if, you know, what other September, October surprises are there? If it is in the shape of the tax returns, you know, what does it do to Donald Trump's base, and what does it do, more importantly, to those potential swing voters who he's trying to lure because of all the problems they have with Hillary Clinton?
I just don't see any other time in history where a candidate hasn't released their tax returns, has such a spotted business record, and they are still a major candidate with huge support and running neck and neck with a career politician. There's no other time in history where that's happened. If Barack Obama had these issues in his past, if he was a shady law professor and had been disciplined, he wouldn't have become president of the United States. If Hillary Clinton had a sort of refused to release her taxes and there were, you know, huge issues around whether she had stiffed people for millions of dollars or was lying about her wealth, she wouldn't be in this position. So those people who support Trump, obviously at this point, they are not fazed by that. They're not looking at that. They're saying, you know what, we're willing to look past that because we believe that Trump is speaking for us. We believe that he's challenging the status quo. He's what, you know, Washington needs. He's what politics in this country needs. So those issues are done for those people.
I mean, I think you hit on some really good points there, both of you, obviously, and that, you know, the question is the people he needs to convince to win, because the current support that he has, at least according to the the poll averages, not just the most recent poll, all the statistical analysis you can do, especially in potential swing states, are that he needs to pick up support, right? He has his base fairly cemented. Almost any Republican candidate at this point or Democratic candidate starts with 40%, right? The country is, you know, that sort of split. Can he use the debates, especially the first one, to really reel in some new people who are just starting to pay attention, unlike those of us who've been paying attention for a year plus? Can he bring some new people into the fold? And, you know, on the taxes, you bring up excellent points. There's very few Fridays left to release those taxes, right? On a Friday news dump, there's very few moments left for him to do that. And you would think maybe leading into the first debate, it could be a good time to just sort of get this stuff out there and then deal with it and try to move past it. But I don't know that's coming. There must be some things in there he really doesn't want people to see.
Those taxes.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to leave it there. That's all the time we have today. I'm Ben Max on behalf of my co-hosts Brigid and Jeff. Thank you for watching this special election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.